The late 19th century was a time of chaos and uncertainty in the Wild West. It was a land without law, where the boundaries between good and evil were thin, and criminals not only survived but thrived. In a world where justice was optional, the most astute and brave men ruled. The landscape was a vast desert and dusty towns, where survival was the only certainty. In this environment, the course of history was about to be altered by two figures who would become legends: Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. Butch Cassidy was not an ordinary outlaw. He had a sharp mind and undeniable charisma. His talent lay not just in his skills of theft and escape, but also in his ability to lead and captivate others with his vision. He was a man who knew how to handle adversity and always seemed a step ahead of the lawmen. But despite his intelligence and cunning, the solitude of being a fugitive accompanied him. And it was in this bleak landscape that he found his partner, Sundance Kid. Sundance Kid was the opposite of Butch in many ways. While Butch was the strategist, Sundance was the man of action. Quick, precise, and deadly, he had a more taciturn temperament, but his loyalty to Butch and the gang was unquestionable. His skill with firearms made him a legend on the battlefield. While Butch formulated the plans, Sundance executed them with precision, becoming the leader's right hand. Together, they formed an unstoppable duo, but their lives soon took an unexpected turn when their destinies crossed. The first encounter between Butch and Sundance wasn't one of friendship, but necessity. During a failed bank robbery, the two found themselves in a situation where there was no turning back. Butch's plans, usually flawless, failed. The resulting gunfight forced the two to flee. But, like in every great story, this failure turned into something bigger, a partnership that, though unlikely, would become one of the most famous in the Wild West. What began as a failure would now fuel the flame of a legend. After the fateful encounter between Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, their partnership solidified in a unique way. With a failed bank robbery, the two began to understand that only the union of their skills could ensure survival in an unforgiving world. Butch, with his strategic mind, began to plan the biggest robberies the Wild West had ever seen. Sundance, with his flawless skill with weapons, was Butch's right hand, executing the operations. Together, they began to form a deadly duo, with an ambitious vision of creating a criminal empire in the West. The gang formed from this union would be called the Wild Bunch. It wasn't just a gang of criminals, but an unstoppable force operating with rare precision. While Butch led, drawing up the plans and ensuring that the escapes were as swift as the robberies, Sundance stood out for his skill with firearms, making the gang even more feared. The Wild Bunch grew quickly, recruiting other outlaws and establishing a series of train and bank robberies that caused panic in several towns. What made the Wild Bunch stand out was not only the audacity of its members, but also the near-supernatural ability to escape from authorities. The gang operated with an informant network, creating escape routes and establishing an unparalleled criminal network in the West. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the authorities were always one step behind. But the members of the Wild Bunch were aware that their luck would eventually run out, and this awareness made them even more audacious. However, what seemed like a life of achievements and wealth at the expense of the poor and the institutions began to weigh on the consciences of Butch and Sundance. Both, despite their criminal nature, began to reflect on the consequences of their actions. But the pressure of constant escapes and the relentless pursuit of the authorities kept them on the move, forcing them to live in a way few could understand. Their ambition seemed insatiable, but what lay ahead would prove to be more treacherous than anyone could have imagined. After a series of successful robberies, the Wild Bunch began to be relentlessly pursued by U.S. authorities. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and the increasingly risky escapes began to take their toll. Life in the West, with its open lands and sense of freedom, was becoming more and more limited. It was at this critical moment that Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid made an audacious decision: to flee to South America. Bolivia, with its vast and unexplored borders, seemed like the perfect place to start anew, far from the relentless pursuit of U.S. law enforcement. Moving to Bolivia wasn't easy. The environment was completely different from what they were used to. Instead of dry lands and strategic plans, the two men found themselves facing a culture and landscapes that were, at first, as unknown as the pursuit they were running from. But Butch's determination and Sundance's skill with firearms helped them quickly integrate into their new home. They teamed up with local criminals and began robbing banks and trains, maintaining the same pattern of their former operations, but now in unfamiliar territory where authorities were even less prepared to deal with outlaws. The strategy seemed to be working. Butch and Sundance were making a fortune while simultaneously escaping the Bolivian authorities, who were powerless in the face of their skills. However, the life of fugitives and criminals comes with a price, and it didn't take long for the tension to start affecting their relationship. While Butch began questioning whether to continue his life in crime, Sundance seemed more comfortable in his new identity as a fugitive. With each passing day, the two were further removed from their origins in the Wild West and more immersed in a life of violence and constant fear. They were beginning to realize that, despite all the wealth they had amassed, freedom seemed more distant than ever. But nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. The months of relative calm were interrupted when a series of events led to a treacherous ambush. The Bolivian authorities, with the help of mercenaries and bounty hunters, began to corner the fugitives more efficiently. Butch and Sundance knew their options were running out. The only way out was to face their fate head-on, with no more flight, no more plans. But what they didn't know was that this decision would lead to the conclusion of their journey in a violent and definitive way. As the months passed in their new life in Bolivia, the pressure on Butch and Sundance grew, but not only from the pursuit of the authorities. What once seemed like a life of adventure and freedom, far from the laws and judgments of society, began to turn into a psychological prison. Butch, the leader of the duo, began to question whether it was really worth continuing with the robberies and escapes. The countless lives destroyed by the actions of the wild bunch, and the feeling that each step they took was leading them deeper into an endless spiral of violence, made him reflect. He was no longer sure if what he was doing was still just a fight for survival, or if it had become a reckless quest for power and wealth. Sundance, on the other hand, always more introspective and focused, seemed to be the pillar of the duo. However, even he began to feel the emotional toll of a life of constant escapes and confrontations. While his loyalty to Butch was unquestionable, he also carried his own ghosts. The death and destruction always around him seemed to start affecting his view on what they were doing. The friendship and partnership between the two were still strong, but the weight of the choices they had made was beginning to affect them differently. They were far from home, isolated in a world that no longer seemed like the Wild West they had started in. The moral dilemma emerging in both men seemed inevitable. They both saw themselves as criminals, but at the same time, the awareness that their actions were increasingly out of control troubled them. They were no longer just the feared and revered wild bunch of the West. They were now two men hunted by an empire of justice and punishment, living with a constant feeling that the end was near. Butch began to feel that the only way to escape this life was to cut all ties with the past, but that meant abandoning everything they knew, including his friendship with Sundance. However, for Sundance, the doubts were darker and harder to resolve. For him, running and fighting until the end seemed to be his only option, as the alternative was being captured, convicted, and dying in a humiliating way. The fear of imminent death mixed with a desire to finish the journey on his own terms, even if the price was the end. The conversations between the two about the future of the gang, their friendship, and the life they had chosen became more difficult, as neither of them wanted to truly face the reality that, in some way, death would be the only answer to their story. Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid were beginning to realize that their lives were nearing the end, but before it happened, there was still one last chance to mark the West definitively. With the authorities hot on their trail and escape options dwindling, Butch began planning a daring robbery, the biggest one they had ever done. An armored train loaded with immense riches would be the perfect target. It was the kind of heist that could secure them a fortune, allowing them to live peacefully, far from the constant pursuit and risk. But as always, there was a price to pay. The preparation for the robbery was meticulously planned. Butch, with his strategic mind, calculated every move, every possible escape route. Sundance, with his natural skill with weapons, was the guarantee that the operation would be executed with precision. Together, they knew time was running out, and any mistake could mean certain death. But the promise of wealth and freedom drove them on, as a final opportunity to escape the clutches of justice. The day of the robbery came, and everything seemed to go according to plan. The train was loaded with money, and the two outlaws prepared for action. But, as in all great stories, something went wrong. An unforeseen event put Butch and Sundance in a desperate situation. What was supposed to be a perfect heist turned into a nightmare. During the robbery, a series of failures and unforeseen events began to unfold. The train, instead of following its usual route, was diverted to a more isolated area, and the authorities, finally alerted, started approaching faster than expected. As they fled, adrenaline took over the two men, but with every mile they covered, the feeling that the end was near became more real. The money, which initially seemed to be the key to freedom, now felt like a burden of hopelessness. The escape turned into a race against time, and their own ghosts that were chasing them. Butch and Sundance's last attempt to leave a legacy in the West was about to end in failure. But even so, they could not turn back. Crime, fame, and legend now consumed them, and there was no escape. After the failure of the train robbery, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid found themselves in a desperate situation. Fleeing was no longer a viable option, and the two men were aware that destiny awaited them. They had escaped countless times, faced enemies, but now they were surrounded on all sides. The Bolivian authorities, along with mercenaries and bounty hunters, were closer than ever. Every escape route seemed closed, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The end was near, but Butch and Sundance, always courageous, were ready to face the inevitable. The decision to face the final confrontation was made in a moment of anguished clarity. There would be no more escape, no more attempts to cheat death. Their fate was sealed, and now all that remained was to fight until the end. The chosen location for this final clash was a small isolated town in Bolivia, where they would take refuge, waiting for the final showdown. Every step they took increased the tension, knowing that soon the enemy forces would arrive to end their legend. The only thing left was to show the world, and themselves, that they would die with their heads held high. The confrontation was brutal, as expected. But the difference now was that both men were older, more tired, and had fewer chances of survival. The number of enemies and the strength of the surrounding police forces seemed overwhelming. The ensuing gunfight was intense, with both men demonstrating their courage and skill, but at the same time, being aware that their chances of survival were almost non-existent. Sundance, always the quiet and calculating one, was determined to fight until the end, while Butch, though reluctant, prepared for the final battle, without any illusions that he would leave alive. The final confrontation was the culmination of a life of quick actions, tough choices, and a constant struggle for freedom. Butch and Sundance fought until the last second, not as criminals, but as men who, for a brief moment, dared to defy fate and death. In the end, what remained was the legend, the story that, even though tragic, would become immortal. Both knew the end was near, but their courage in the face of death, their loyalty to each other, made this confrontation a symbol of what it meant to be an outlaw in the Wild West. After the death of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, their figures became immortal legends of the Wild West. But what truly remained behind was not just the story of two outlaws who defied death at every turn. The true legacy of Butch and Sundance was the mark they left on subsequent generations. They were not just criminals who robbed banks and trains, but men who, on their own terms, challenged a system that had marginalized them. Their actions and choices made them heroes and villains at the same time, creating a mythology that still fascinates audiences today. The impact of their story was felt long after their deaths. The Wild Bunch, as a gang, became a symbol of rebellion and resistance to the system. Butch and Sundance, by fleeing from the law and opting for a life of crime, represented the pursuit of freedom in a world that restricted the possibilities of those who did not conform. However, their tragic deaths also brought forth a reflection on the fragility of freedom and the costs of crime. Their lives, marked by constant flight and the fight against an oppressive system, inspired many, but also served as a warning about the limits of such rebellion. The myth of Butch and Sundance did not stop at the borders of the Wild West. Over time, their stories were told and retold in films, books, and songs, creating an ideal of wild freedom, but also showing the consequences of this freedom without limits. The romanticism of the outlaw life was revealed with all its flaws and tragedies, making them tragic yet heroic figures. Even with all the mistakes they made, Butch and Sundance became cultural icons, representing the desire to escape an oppressive reality while facing death with courage and loyalty. In the end, the true legacy of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid is how their stories continue to inspire. Even in an era where outlaw figures are often vilified, the legend of Butch and Sundance resurges with an aura of mystery and fascination. Their friendship, courage, and resistance to the system continue to be told, making them immortal in one of the greatest myths of the Wild West. They are not just figures of the past, but represent the eternal conflict between freedom and the limitations imposed by society. The death of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid did not mark the end of their stories, but merely the beginning of a new chapter in the popular imagination. Although the Wild West changed and the frontier was closed, the legend of both continues to grow with each passing decade. The legend is not confined to the distant past, but transforms and reinvents itself, attracting new generations who identify with the idea of rebellion and freedom. The myth of Butch and Sundance transcends the real story, becoming something more than just criminals. They became symbols of resistance, the desire for freedom, and the quest for their own destiny, free from society's constraints. Over the years, the stories about them gained layers of romanticism, and their courage in the face of death was shaped by the narrative that turned them into heroes of a time of chaos. But at the same time, this legend is permeated by the tragedy of their choices. The relentless pursuit of freedom, without the ability to see the consequences of their actions, becomes a lesson for all those who believe that living on the fringes of society is a solution to their own dilemmas. The myth of Butch and Sundance remains a warning while also inspiring those who, like them, seek to break free from the chains that bind them to the system. Though the reality was harsh and their lives were marked by violence and constant flight, their story also teaches us about the complexity of human choices. Butch and Sundance were not just criminals. They were men who lived by their own rules, defying a system that didn't understand them, but in the end had no mercy. Their lives show us the price of rebellion and the search for an alternative path, and how, in some stories, death is the only answer to the end of the cycle. But, in a broader sense, the legacy of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid will never be completely erased. Their stories will be retold in many ways, always with something new to offer. They continue to represent the struggle of the individual against society, the eternal quest for freedom, and the desire to challenge expectations, even knowing that the end may be tragic. In the heart of the Wild West, where everything was possible, the true meaning of Butch and Sundance's story is that, in some legends, the end never truly comes. They live forever in the memory of those who dare to dream of a life without boundaries.